was a quiet Tuesday evening in the small town of Riverside, Ohio. The sun was setting, painting the suburban streets in golden light. Most people were getting home from work, settling in for dinner with their families. But for 68-year-old Robert Johnson, this ordinary evening was about to become anything but ordinary. Robert had just finished speaking at the local community college. He'd been invited to talk about his career in law enforcement to a group of criminal justice students. At his age, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Robert looked like everyone's favorite grandfather. He was wearing his best navy blue suit, the same one he'd worn to countless important meetings over the years. The presentation had gone well. The students had been fascinated by his stories, though he'd only shared the ones he was allowed to tell. There were many more stories locked away, classified and too sensitive for young ears. As he walked to his car, several students had thanked him and asked for advice about their futures in law enforcement. "Always remember," he had told them, "treat every person with dignity. You never know who you're dealing with, and more importantly, every person deserves respect regardless of who they are." Now, driving his well-maintained Honda Accord through the quiet streets, Robert was thinking about his granddaughter Lisa. He'd promised to stop by her apartment to drop off some old photo albums. She was working on a school project about family, history, and wanted pictures from his career. The radio played soft jazz as he drove carefully through the residential area. At 68, Robert was a cautious driver. He'd seen too many accidents in his younger days. Too many lives changed in split seconds because someone was careless behind the wheel. That's when he saw the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. Robert's heart didn't race. After decades in law enforcement, he understood these situations. He calmly pulled over to the curb, turned off his engine, and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. He rolled down his window and waited. The officer who approached his car was young, maybe in his early 30s, with short blonde hair and an aggressive swagger. His name tag read, Officer Mills. There was something in the man's eyes that Robert recognized immediately. A hardness, a prejudgment that had nothing to do with traffic violations. "License and registration," Mills barked, not bothering with pleasantries. "Of course, officer," Robert replied calmly. "May I ask what the reason for the stop was?" Mills's face tightened. "You were swerving back there, looked suspicious." Robert knew he hadn't been swerving. He'd been driving exactly 5 miles under the speed limit, hands at 10 and 2, following every traffic rule perfectly. But he also knew better than to argue with an agitated officer on a dark street. "I understand," Robert said quietly. "Let me get my license for you." As he reached for his wallet in his jacket pocket, Mills stepped back and put his hand on his weapon. "Slow movements," Mills shouted. "What are you reaching for?" "Just my wallet, officer. My license is inside." Robert moved very slowly, very deliberately. He'd trained hundreds of officers over the years on proper traffic stop procedures. He knew that quick movements could be misinterpreted even by well-trained officers. And something told him that Officer Mills wasn't particularly well-trained. When Robert handed over his driver's license, Mills examined it with a frown. "Robert Johnson," Mills read aloud. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" The question hit Robert like a cold wave. This was 2019, not 1959. But here was a police officer asking a law-abiding citizen what he was doing in a public neighborhood, as if certain areas were off-limits to certain people. "I was visiting the community college," Robert answered honestly. "I gave a presentation to some students." Mills laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right, and what kind of presentation would that be?" Robert felt his jaw tighten slightly. In all his years, through all the challenges he'd faced, he'd learned to control his emotions. But this young officer's attitude was testing even his considerable patience. "I spoke to criminal justice students about careers in law enforcement," Robert said evenly. "Sure you did," Mills sneered. "Step out of the vehicle." "Officer, may I?" "Ask why. Step out of the vehicle now." Robert knew he had a choice. He could identify himself, show his credentials, make this whole thing disappear. One look at his FBI badge, and Officer Mills would probably start apologizing and calling him sir. But Robert had learned something important over his long career. If you only get respect when people know who you are, then the system is broken. He wanted to see how he would be treated as just Robert Johnson, retired grandfather, black man in a nice suit driving through a suburban neighborhood. So he got out of the car. Mills immediately became more aggressive. Put your hands on the vehicle, spread your legs. Officer, I don't understand what I've done wrong, Robert said, but he complied. I smell marijuana, Mills announced loudly. Robert almost laughed. He'd never smoked anything in his life, not even cigarettes. His car was immaculate, detailed just the week before. There was nothing in it except some papers from his presentation and a bottle of water. Officer, there's no marijuana in my vehicle. I don't use drugs. We'll see about that, Mills said, and began searching the car aggressively. Robert watched as Mills tore through his glove compartment, scattered his papers on the ground, and searched under the seats. The officer was clearly frustrated when he found nothing. What's in your pockets? Mills demanded. My wallet, keys, phone, and some breath mints, Robert replied honestly. Empty them, all of them. Robert did as he was told. He placed each item carefully on the roof of his car. Mills examined everything, even opening the container of mints and smelling them. When Mills found nothing suspicious, his frustration seemed to turn into anger. You think you're smart, don't you? Mills said, stepping closer to Robert. Coming into this neighborhood with your fancy car and your suit thinking you belong here. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. He'd investigated cases that started exactly like this. Good people minding their own business who encountered officers who saw skin color before they saw human beings. Officer, I'm not looking for any trouble, Robert said quietly. I was just driving home. Driving home to where? Mills pressed. You don't live around here. I live in Columbus, Robert answered truthfully. Columbus, Mills repeated mockingly. Long way from home, aren't you? What are you really doing here? Robert took a deep breath. He thought about all the young officers he'd trained over the years, all the lectures he'd given about treating people with dignity. He thought about his granddaughter, who would be waiting for those photo albums. He thought about the criminal justice students he'd just spoken to, full of hope and idealism about their chosen profession. And then he looked at Officer Mills, a man who wore the same badge that Robert had worn for 45 years, but who seemed to understand nothing about what that badge really meant. Officer, Robert said carefully, I understand you're just doing your job, but I've done nothing wrong. I haven't broken any laws. I've cooperated with everything you've asked. What exactly are you looking for? Mills's face flushed red. Are you questioning me? I'm asking a reasonable question. Don't you dare question my authority, Mills shouted, and suddenly grabbed Robert's arm, spinning him around and slamming him face first against the car. The impact knocked the breath out of Robert's lungs. At 68, his body wasn't as strong as it used to be. The force of being slammed against the car sent sharp pain through his chest and ribs. You have the right to remain silent. Mills began reciting Miranda rights while roughly handcuffing Robert's hands behind his back. But Robert wasn't listening to the words. He was thinking about something else entirely. He was thinking about a conversation he'd had with his granddaughter just last week. Grandpa, she had asked, do you think things have really changed? Like, with racism and police and everything? He had told her that things were better, that progress took time, that most officers were good people trying to do a difficult job. He had told her that his generation had fought hard to make things better for her generation. Now, standing handcuffed on a suburban street, his ribs aching from being slammed against his own car, Robert wondered if he had been too optimistic. Mills shoved him into the back of the patrol car with unnecessary force. The movement sent another sharp pain through Robert's chest. You picked the wrong cop to mess with, Mills said as he slammed the car door. As they drove toward the police station, Robert closed his eyes and tried to manage the pain in his ribs. He thought about all the times he'd made similar drives, but from the other side, transporting suspects, some guilty, some innocent, all deserving of basic human treatment. He had no way of knowing that this traffic stop would soon become national news. He had no way of knowing that Officer Mills was about to learn exactly who he had just arrested. He had no way of knowing that this night would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved. All he knew was that his chest hurt, his granddaughter was waiting for him, and somewhere, the system he'd spent his life serving had failed him in the most basic way possible. The patrol car pulled into the police station parking lot, and Robert took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever came next. After 45 years in law enforcement, he thought he'd seen everything. The Riverside Police Department was quiet that Tuesday night. Most of the evening shift officers were out on patrol, leaving just a few desk sergeants and administrators to handle booking and paperwork. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that harsh institutional glow that all police stations seem to have. Officer Mills dragged Robert through the back entrance, still handcuffed and walking with obvious discomfort. Each step sent pain shooting through Robert's ribs, but he kept his expression calm and controlled. Years of training had taught him never to show weakness, especially not now. Sergeant Patricia Williams was working the night desk. She was a 20-year veteran with graying hair and the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from seeing everything at least twice. When Mills brought Robert in, she looked up from her paperwork with practiced indifference. "What do we have?" she asked. Not really interested. Suspicious person, obstruction of justice, resisting arrest. Mills rattled off the charges like he was reading a grocery list. Sergeant Williams looked at Robert, this well-dressed elderly man who could have been her own father, and then back at Mills. Something didn't add up. "Resisting arrest?" she asked. "He doesn't look like he put up much of a fight." Mills's jaw tightened. He was argumentative, questioned my authority. Robert said nothing. He'd learned long ago that booking areas had cameras and microphones. Everything was being recorded, and he wanted his silence noted just as much as Mills's words. Sergeant Williams began the standard booking process, but she noticed something that Mills had apparently missed. This wasn't some random troublemaker. Robert's posture, his calm demeanor, the way he responded to questions. This man had been through this process before, but from the other side. "Name?" she asked. "Robert Johnson." "Address?" Robert provided, his Columbus address clearly and completely. "Occupation?" There was a pause. Robert looked directly at Sergeant Williams. "Retired federal agent." Mills, who had been leaning against the wall looking smug, suddenly straightened up. "What did you say?" "I said retired federal agent," Robert repeated calmly. Sergeant Williams stopped typing. In 20 years, she'd booked drug dealers, thieves, drunk drivers, and everything in between. But she'd never booked a federal agent. Current or retired, that was the kind of arrest that generated paperwork, phone calls, and questions from supervisors. "What kind of federal agent?" she asked carefully. "FBI, 45 years of service." The room went completely silent. Mills's face had gone pale. Sergeant Williams set down her pen and looked at Robert with new eyes. "Sir," she said, her tone completely changed. "Do you have identification to verify that?" Robert nodded toward his personal effects, which had been placed in a plastic bag. "My credentials are in my wallet." Sergeant Williams opened the bag and carefully removed Robert's wallet. Inside, alongside his driver's license and credit cards, was a leather credential case. She opened it and stared. The badge was real. The identification card was real. And the man sitting in front of her, who Officer Mills had just arrested for being suspicious, was FBI Special Agent Robert Johnson, retired. But that wasn't all. As Sergeant Williams examined the credentials more closely, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. This wasn't just any FBI agent. The credential case contained commendation cards, and the dates went back to 1974. "Mills," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Mills walked over reluctantly. When he saw the FBI badge, his face went from pale to green. That's probably fake," he stammered. "Lots of people have fake badges." Sergeant Williams had seen fake badges. This wasn't one of them. The weight, the detail, the wear patterns, everything about it screamed authentic. Plus, why would someone carry a fake FBI badge and then wait until after being arrested to mention it? Sir, she said to Robert, I need to ask you some questions. Robert nodded. I understand. Did you identify yourself as a federal agent during the traffic stop? No, I did not. Why not? Robert was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. I wanted to see how I would be treated as a regular citizen. Mills erupted. That's entrapment. You can't do that. Robert looked at him calmly. Officer, I broke no laws. I identified myself honestly when asked. I cooperated with all of your requests. I never lied about who I was. Sergeant Williams was already reaching for the phone. This situation was way above her pay grade. But as she started to dial, she noticed Robert wince in pain and unconsciously touch his side. Are you injured, sir? She asked. I believe I may have some bruised ribs, Robert said quietly. I'd like to see a medic if possible. Mills scoffed. He's fine, he's just trying to make trouble. But Sergeant Williams had been doing this job long enough to recognize when someone was hurt. She'd also been doing it long enough to know that injuries sustained during arrest could become very big problems very quickly, especially when the person being arrested turned out to be a retired FBI agent. I'm calling the paramedics, she announced. That's not necessary, Mills protested. Officer Mills, Sergeant Williams said sharply, that's not your call to make. While they waited for the paramedics, Sergeant Williams tried to piece together what had happened. She pulled Mills aside. Walk me through this arrest, she said quietly. Mills told his version of events. Traffic stop for swerving. Suspicious behavior. Smelled marijuana. Subject became argumentative and resisted arrest. But even as he told the story, Mills knew it sounded weak, especially now that they knew who Robert really was. When the paramedics arrived, they immediately noticed Robert's discomfort. After a quick examination, the senior paramedic, a woman named Kelly Martinez with 15 years of experience, pulled Sergeant Williams aside. This man needs to go to the hospital, she said quietly. I'm feeling possible rib fractures, and at his age that could be serious. If one of those ribs punctures a lung. How bad are we talking? Sergeant Williams asked. Bad enough that I'm not comfortable leaving him here. He needs x-rays, and he needs them now. Sergeant Williams looked back at Robert, who was sitting quietly, still handcuffed, still maintaining his dignity despite obvious pain. Then she looked at Mills, who was shifting nervously from foot to foot. We're taking him to the hospital, she decided. Is that really necessary? Mills asked. He's probably just faking it. Kelly Martinez, the paramedic, gave Mills a look that could have frozen water. Officer, I've been doing this for 15 years. This man has injuries consistent with blunt force trauma to the chest. Are you telling me that happened before you arrested him? Mills couldn't answer that question, not honestly. At the hospital, things moved quickly. Robert was taken to an examination room where Dr. Jennifer Chen, the attending physician, began her assessment. She was thorough and professional, but Robert could see the questions in her eyes as she noticed the handcuffs and the police escort. Can you tell me how you were injured? She asked. I was slammed against a car during my arrest, Robert said simply. Dr. Chen looked at Sergeant Williams, who had accompanied them to the hospital. Was he resisting arrest? According to the arresting officer, yes, Williams said carefully. And what was he arrested for? Williams hesitated. Being suspicious in a neighborhood, obstruction of justice. Dr. Chen raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She'd seen enough questionable arrests over the years to know when something didn't smell right. The x-rays revealed what the paramedic had suspected: 3 cracked ribs and significant bruising. At Robert's age, these weren't minor injuries. Mr. Johnson, Dr. Chen said, you're going to need to stay overnight for observation. Rib injuries in patients your age can lead to complications. That's when Robert made a decision that would change everything. Doctor, he said quietly, I need you to contact someone for me. Her name is Director Catherine Walsh. She's at FBI headquarters in Washington. Dr. Chen looked confused. I'm sorry, sir, but why would you want me to contact the FBI? Robert looked her directly in the eyes. Because I'm FBI, and Director Walsh is my former boss. Dr. Chen stared at him for a long moment, then looked at his medical chart, then back at him. You're FBI? She asked. Retired. 45 years of service. Dr. Chen had treated a lot of patients over the years, but she'd developed a pretty good sense of when people were telling the truth. This man, even injured and handcuffed to a hospital bed, had an authority about him that couldn't be faked. I'll make the call, she said. 3 hours later, a black SUV pulled up to the hospital. 2 people got out, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a stern expression, and a younger man in a dark suit carrying a briefcase. Director Catherine Walsh had driven straight from Washington the moment she got the call. She'd worked with Robert Johnson for over 20 years, and when she heard he was in a hospital, handcuffed to a bed after being beaten by a local police officer, she'd immediately gotten in her car. The man with her was Agent David Park from FBI Internal Affairs. This situation was about to become very complicated very quickly. When Director Walsh walked into Robert's hospital room and saw him handcuffed to the bed, her face went stone cold. Get those handcuffs off him, she told Sergeant Williams, who had been waiting nervously for hours. Ma'am, I can't do that without authorization from... I'm FBI Director Catherine Walsh, she said, showing her credentials. Agent Johnson is a federal employee. Those handcuffs come off right now. Sergeant Williams fumbled for her keys. She'd never had an FBI Director. Catherine Walsh sat in the hospital room, holding a file that was thicker than most phone books. She'd brought it from Washington because she knew that once word got out about what happened to Robert Johnson, people would want to know exactly who Officer Mills had assaulted. The story of Robert's career wasn't just impressive. It was legendary. Agent David Park from Internal Affairs was setting up a recording device. This interview would become part of the official investigation, but Catherine knew it would also serve another purpose. When this case inevitably went public, people would need to understand just who Robert Johnson really was. Bobby, Catherine said gently, we need to go through this properly. David needs to document everything for the investigation. Robert nodded, though moving his head still sent pain through his injured ribs. I understand. Let's start at the beginning, Agent Park said. Can you state your full name and service record for the recording? Robert looked directly into the camera. Robert William Johnson, FBI Special Agent, retired, badge number 2847, 45 years of service, 1974 to 2019. But those basic facts didn't even begin to tell the real story. Catherine opened the file. Bobby, maybe we should help people understand what those 45 years really meant. She turned to Agent Park. David, Agent Johnson didn't just work for the FBI for 45 years. He was part of history. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his hospital bed. He'd never been one for attention or praise, but Catherine was right. People needed to understand. Tell them about 1974, Catherine prompted. Robert was quiet for a moment, remembering. I was 23 years old when I graduated from Quantico. There were only 12 black agents in my training class out of 300 recruits. The country was still dealing with the civil rights movement, and a lot of people didn't think we belonged in the Bureau. He paused, looking out the hospital window at the dark Ohio night. My first assignment was in Mississippi, 1974. The Klan was still active, still bombing churches, still killing people. My supervisor told me I had 2 choices. I could work desk cases and stay safe, or I could do the job I was trained to do. What did you choose? Agent Park asked, though from Robert's reputation, he probably already knew the answer. I went undercover. Catherine leaned forward. Tell him about the Crawford case. Robert's expression grew serious. 1975. 3 civil rights workers had been murdered in Meridian County, Mississippi. Local police said it was gang violence, case closed, but families kept calling the FBI saying the local police were involved. Agent Park stopped taking notes and just listened. I went in as a construction worker, Robert continued. Spent 8 months building houses during the day and drinking beer with local Klan members at night. 8 months of listening to them brag about killing troublemakers and how they had friends in the sheriff's department. Catherine pulled out a newspaper clipping from the file. The headline read, FBI breaks Klan murder ring, undercover. Agent exposes police corruption. 6 arrests, Robert said quietly. Including the sheriff and 2 deputies, 3 life sentences. But that was just the beginning. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Robert became the Bureau's go-to agent for civil rights cases. He investigated police departments in Chicago, Detroit, Los Angeles, and a dozen other cities. He went undercover in white supremacist groups, sometimes for months at a time, gathering evidence of plots and conspiracies. Catherine pulled out more documents. 1983, the Atlanta child murders case. Bobby was part of the task force. 1987, she continued, the Howard Beach incident in New York. Bobby led the federal investigation. 1992, the Rodney King case aftermath. Bobby was sent to Los Angeles to investigate police misconduct. With each case Catherine mentioned, Agent Park's eyes grew wider. He was looking at a man who had been personally involved in some of the most significant civil rights investigations of the last 50 years. But Robert's work hadn't been limited to civil rights cases. "Tell him about Oklahoma City," Catherine said softly. Robert's face darkened. "April 19th, 1995. I was in the field office in Oklahoma City when the bomb went off. I felt the building shake." He was quiet for a long moment, remembering. "People died that day. 19 of them were children. I spent the next 2 years of my life tracking down every lead, every connection, every person who might have helped Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols." Catherine pulled out a photo from the file. It showed Robert standing next to President Bill Clinton at a ceremony in Washington. Bobby received the FBI's Medal of Valor for his work on the Oklahoma City bombing case, she explained to Agent Park. He personally interviewed over 300 witnesses and suspects. His investigation led to additional arrests and prevented other planned attacks. But even that wasn't the end of the story. 2001, Catherine continued. September 11th, Bobby was one of the senior agents assigned to the 9/11 investigation. Robert nodded grimly. "I spent 3 years tracking down leads, following money trails, interviewing suspects. We knew that preventing the next attack was more important than anything else we'd ever done." Catherine pulled out another photo. This one showing Robert with President George W. Bush. 2004. "Presidential Medal of Freedom," she said, "for exceptional service to national security." Agent Park had stopped taking notes entirely. He was staring at Robert with something approaching awe. "Sir," he said quietly, "I had no idea." Robert smiled slightly, the first time he'd smiled since arriving at the hospital. "Agent Park, most people don't. That's the point of our work. We're not supposed to be famous," but Catherine wasn't done. She pulled out a magazine from the file. "Time magazine, May 1995, she said, showing Agent Park the cover. "America's top cop." There was Robert, 24 years younger but with the same steady eyes and calm expression, on the cover of one of the nation's most prestigious magazines. The article called Bobby the FBI agent who never gives up, Catherine read. In a career spanning 2 decades, Special Agent Robert Johnson has been personally responsible for solving some of America's most challenging cases. His colleagues describe him as relentless, brilliant, and absolutely incorruptible. Robert shifted uncomfortably. "Kate, that's enough." "No, Bobby, it's not enough," Catherine said firmly. "Because tomorrow, when this story breaks, people need to know who Officer Mills put in handcuffs. They need to know who he slammed against that car." She pulled out more documents. 2008, Bobby led the investigation into a domestic terrorism cell, planning to attack the Democratic National Convention. His work prevented what could have been a massacre. 2011, he cracked a human trafficking ring that had been operating for 15 years, saved over 200 victims. 2016, his final major case, before retirement. A conspiracy involving corrupt politicians, organized crime, and international money laundering. 12 high-level convictions, including a sitting congressman. Agent Park was shaking his head in amazement. "Sir, why didn't you identify yourself during the traffic stop? One look at your credentials and Officer Mills would have..." Would have what? Robert interrupted gently. Treated me with respect because of my badge? Agent Park, if people only get treated fairly when they have power or status, then we haven't really solved anything. Catherine leaned back in her chair. She'd worked with Robert for 20 years, and she'd never stopped being amazed by his integrity. There's something else you should know, she told Agent Park. The conference room at FBI headquarters where we hold our most sensitive briefings. It's called the Robert Johnson Conference Room. Agent Park's mouth fell open. Bobby donated his entire federal salary for the last 5 years of his career to a scholarship fund for minority students studying criminal justice. Catherine continued. He's personally mentored over 200 young agents. Half the current senior staff at headquarters learned their jobs from him. She pulled out one final document from the file. This is Bobby's commendation record, she said, handing it to Agent Park. Agent Park scanned the list. Medal of Valor, Presidential Medal of Freedom, FBI Director's Award for Excellence Distinguished, Service Medal, Civil Rights Leadership Award, and dozens of others. 45 years, Catherine said quietly. 45 years of chasing the worst people in America. 45 years of standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. 45 years of putting his life on the line for his country. She looked at Robert, who was trying to stay awake despite the pain medication. And last night, Officer Mills looked at this man and saw a threat. He saw someone who didn't belong in a nice neighborhood. He saw someone he could push around. Agent Park was quiet for a long time, processing everything he'd heard. Sir, he finally said to Robert, I'm so sorry this happened to you. Robert looked at the young agent with tired but kind eyes. Agent Park, he said softly, don't apologize to me. This isn't about me. This is about every person who gets pulled over and doesn't have an FBI badge to protect them. This is about every person who gets treated badly because of what they look like instead of who they are. Outside in the hallway, Catherine could hear voices. Word was spreading through law enforcement circles. FBI agents were arriving from Columbus and Cincinnati. The local police chief was in the building, probably, having the W. By Wednesday morning, the Riverside Police Department looked like a war zone. News vans lined the street outside. Reporters were camping out, waiting for any official statement about what everyone was already calling the Robert Johnson incident. Chief Michael Torres had been police chief for 15 years and he'd never faced anything like this. At 6 a.m., he was sitting in his office, staring at a stack of files that Agent David Park had delivered an hour earlier. The files contained everything the FBI had discovered about Officer Mills in just 12 hours of investigation. It wasn't good. Chief Torres picked up the first file. Officer Derek Mills, Internal Affairs Review, 2018-2023. The file was thick, much thicker than it should have been for a 5-year officer. 23 complaints. 23 separate citizens had filed complaints against Mills in 5 years. 18 of those complaints involved black citizens. The pattern was so clear it was almost like a textbook example of racial profiling. But here was the problem. Not one of those complaints had resulted in serious discipline. Mills had received verbal warnings, brief suspensions, and mandatory training courses. But he'd never faced real consequences. Chief Torres felt sick as he read through the complaints. Officer Mills pulled me over for driving suspiciously in my own neighborhood. I've lived here for 20 years. Kenneth Washington, age 45, filed 2019. Officer Mills searched my car and found nothing, then said I was lucky this time. Angela Davis, age 32, filed 2020. Officer Mills asked me what I was doing in this area, even though I was just walking to work. Michael Thompson, age 28, filed 2021. The pattern was unmistakable. Mills had been targeting black citizens for years, and somehow the system had protected him. Chief Torres heard a knock on his door. Agent Park walked in, followed by 2 other FBI agents. Chief Torres, Agent Park said formally, "We need to talk." For the next 3 hours, the FBI agents laid out what they'd discovered. It wasn't just Officer Mills who was the problem. It was the entire system that had allowed him to continue his behavior for 5 years without consequences. "Chief," Agent Park said, "we've reviewed your department's disciplinary records. In the past 5 years, Officer Mills has received more complaints than any other officer in your department. But he's also received 3 commendations from supervisors. Chief Torres looked at the documents. It was true. While citizens were complaining about Mills's behavior, his supervisors were praising his aggressive policing and high arrest numbers. There's something else, Agent Park continued. We pulled the body camera footage from last night's arrest. Chief Torres watched the video on Agent Park's laptop. What he saw made his stomach turn. The body camera showed Officer Mills approaching Robert's car with an immediately aggressive attitude. There was no evidence of swerving or suspicious driving. Robert was polite, cooperative, and calm throughout the encounter. But then came the part that made Chief Torres want to resign on the spot. The video showed Mills slamming Robert against the car with unnecessary force. It showed him handcuffing a 68-year-old man who was clearly offering no resistance. And most damning of all, it recorded Mills saying, "You picked the wrong cop to mess with." Chief Torres, Agent Park said quietly, "This is a federal civil rights violation. Officer Mills used his position to assault a citizen based on racial bias." Chief Torres rubbed his temples. "What do you need from me?" "Full cooperation. We're launching a comprehensive investigation into your department. We need every complaint file, every disciplinary record, every supervisor evaluation for the past 10 years, Chief Torres nodded. He didn't have a choice. But the FBI investigation was just getting started. Agent Park had assembled a team of 12 agents to examine every aspect of the Riverside Police Department. What they found over the next week shocked everyone involved. The problem wasn't just Officer Mills. The problem was systematic. Agent Jennifer Martinez was reviewing traffic stop data when she made a disturbing discovery. Over the past 3 years, black drivers in Riverside were 3 times more likely to be pulled over than white drivers, despite making up only 12% of the local population. But it got worse. Black drivers who were pulled over were 5 times more likely to have their vehicles searched. And despite all those searches, black drivers were actually less likely to be found with contraband than white drivers. The data painted a clear picture. Black citizens in Riverside were being systematically targeted by police. Agent Thomas Chen was reviewing complaint files when he noticed another pattern. Of the 47 complaints filed against various officers in the past 3 years, 39 involved black citizens. But only 3 of those complaints had resulted in any disciplinary action. Meanwhile, complaints filed by white citizens were taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Agent Martinez brought her findings to Agent Park. "David, this isn't just about Officer Mills," she said, spreading charts and graphs across the conference table they'd set up in a hotel room. "This is about the entire department culture." Agent Park studied the data. "Show me what you found." "Look at this," Agent Martinez said, pointing to a chart. Mills wasn't the worst offender in terms of complaints. Officer Jackson had 29 complaints in 4 years. Officer Rodriguez had 31. Agent Park frowned. "Then why are we focused on Mills?" "Because Mills was the one who made the mistake of assaulting Robert Johnson," Agent Martinez replied. "But the truth is, there are at least 6 officers in this department with similar patterns of behavior." That afternoon, Agent Park called Director Walsh with an update. "Kate, it's worse than we thought," he said. "This isn't one bad cop. This is an entire department with a culture problem." Director Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "David, I want you to expand the investigation. I want to know how this happened, why it was allowed to continue, and who was supposed to be providing oversight." "Ma'am, that could take months." "Then take months. Robert Johnson gave 45 years of his life to the FBI. We're going to find out exactly how a department got so broken that they thought they could treat him like a criminal." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Robert was recovering but insisting on being involved in the investigation. Against doctor's orders, he was reviewing files from his hospital bed. Catherine Walsh visited him every day, bringing updates on the investigation's progress. "Bobby, you need to rest," she said during one visit. "Kate, I can't rest knowing that this is happening to other people," Robert replied. "Look at these complaint files. Look at these patterns." He held up a file that made Catherine's blood run cold. It was a complaint from a 16-year-old black teenager who claimed Officer Mills had stopped him while he was walking home from school. searched him without cause, and threatened to arrest him for looking suspicious. "This kid filed this complaint 8 months ago," Robert said quietly. Nothing happened. No investigation, no follow-up, nothing. Catherine looked at the file. The teenager's name was Jerome Davis. According to the complaint, Officer Mills had made him empty his backpack on the sidewalk in front of his classmates looking for drugs that didn't exist. "Bobby, we're going to make this right," Catherine promised. But as the investigation continued, more disturbing evidence emerged. Agent Park discovered that the department's Internal Affairs Division consisted of exactly one person, Lieutenant Stephen Walsh, no relation to Director Walsh, who was also Officer Mills's drinking buddy and golfing partner. When Agent Park interviewed Lieutenant Walsh, the conversation was revealing. "Look," Lieutenant Walsh said, "Mills is a good cop. He's aggressive, sure, but that's what we need in certain neighborhoods." "What do you mean by certain neighborhoods?" Agent Park asked. Lieutenant Walsh shifted uncomfortably. "You know what I mean. The high crime areas, places where you need to be tough." Agent Park looked at his notes. "Lieutenant, according to our analysis, Officer Mills made 89% of his arrests in low-crime residential areas, not high-crime areas." Lieutenant Walsh couldn't answer that. The investigation also revealed that Chief Torres had been aware of the complaint patterns but had chosen to ignore them. In emails that the FBI subpoenaed, Chief Torres had written to the mayor, "Mills is one of our most productive officers. A few complaints from troublemakers shouldn't derail a good cop's career." But perhaps the most damning evidence came from Officer Mills himself. When FBI agents interviewed him, Mills seemed to believe he had done nothing wrong. "That guy was suspicious," Mills insisted. "He didn't belong in that neighborhood." "Officer Mills," Agent Park said carefully. "What made him suspicious?" Mills paused, realizing the trap. He was driving slowly, looking around. "Driving slowly is legal, isn't it?" "Well, yes, and looking around while driving is also legal?" "I guess, but you had to be there. You had to see how he looked." "How did he look?" Another pause. "Suspicious." Agent Park pressed harder. "Officer Mills, Mr. Johnson is a retired FBI agent who has received the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He was driving home from speaking to criminal justice students about careers in law enforcement. What exactly made him look suspicious?" Mills couldn't answer because the real answer, that Robert looked suspicious because he was black, was something Mills couldn't say out loud, even though everyone in the room knew it was the truth. As the investigation expanded, the FBI discovered that the problems in Riverside weren't unique. Similar patterns existed in police departments across the country. The Robert Johnson. 3 months later, Robert Johnson walked into the Riverside Community Center using a cane. His ribs had healed, but the doctor said he'd always have some stiffness from the injuries. He didn't mind. At 68, he'd earned the right to walk a little slower. The community center was packed. Every seat was filled, and people were standing along the walls. This wasn't a typical town hall meeting. This was the day that would determine the future of the Riverside Police Department. In the front row sat Officer Derek Mills, looking like a man who hadn't slept in months. Next to him was his lawyer, a public defender who looked overwhelmed by the magnitude of the case. Behind them sat Chief Torres, who had submitted his resignation the week before. The mayor was there, several city council members, and representatives from the FBI and Department of Justice. But most importantly, the room was filled with ordinary citizens, people who had been pulled over, searched, questioned, and treated badly by police officers, people who had filed complaints that were ignored, people who had lost faith in the system that was supposed to protect them. Robert had requested this meeting. Against the advice of prosecutors, against the wishes of his own lawyers, against the concerns of Director Walsh, he had insisted on speaking publicly before Officer Mills was sentenced. The federal case had been straightforward. Mills had pleaded guilty to violating Robert's civil rights under color of authority. The evidence was overwhelming. The body camera footage was clear, and Mills's own statements to FBI agents had sealed his fate. He was facing up to 10 years in federal prison. But that's not what Robert wanted to talk about today. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert began, standing at the podium with his cane beside him. 3 months ago, I was arrested on a street not far from here. I was handcuffed, assaulted, and taken to jail for the crime of driving while black. The room was completely silent. I could stand here today and talk about my anger. I could talk about my pain, my disappointment, my frustration with a system that failed me and fails too many of us. Robert looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as possible. But I'm not here to talk about anger. I'm here to talk about change. He turned to look at Officer Mills, who was staring at his hands. Officer Mills, would you please stand up? Mills looked up, confused. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Mills slowly stood up. Officer Mills, Robert said, you don't know me. When you pulled me over that night, you saw what you expected to see. You saw a black man in a nice car in a nice neighborhood, and you decided I didn't belong there. Mills shifted uncomfortably, but didn't speak. You didn't know that I spent 45 years wearing a badge just like yours. You didn't know that I've dedicated my entire adult life to law enforcement and justice. You didn't know that I've received commendations from 4 presidents. Robert paused, letting that sink in. But here's what's important. You shouldn't have needed to know any of that. I deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, not because of my career or my awards, but because I'm a human being. Because every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Mills looked up for the first time, making eye contact with Robert. Officer Mills, I want you to know that I forgive you. A murmur went through the crowd. Mills's lawyer looked shocked. Even the FBI agents in the room seemed surprised. I forgive you because I understand that you are as much a victim of a broken system as I am. Somewhere along the way, you were taught to see certain people as threats instead of citizens. Somewhere along the way, you learned to use your badge as a weapon instead of as a shield. Robert walked slowly toward Mills, his cane tapping on the floor. Officer Mills, you made a terrible mistake. You violated your oath, you broke the law, and you hurt an innocent person. Those are facts, and you will have to face the consequences. Mills nodded, tears starting to form in his eyes. But I also believe that people can change. I believe that you can learn from this mistake and become a better person because of it. Robert stopped directly in front of Mills. Officer Mills, if you're willing to learn, I'm willing to teach. The room erupted. People were talking, some shouting, some crying. The judge called for order, but it took several minutes for the crowd to settle down. Mills wiped his eyes and spoke for the first time. Mr. Johnson, I don't understand. After what I did to you, why would you want to help me? Robert smiled gently. Officer Mills, I've spent my entire career trying to make the world more just. That doesn't mean just punishing wrongdoers. It means trying to prevent wrong from happening in the first place. He turned back to address the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, we can send Officer Mills to prison for 10 years, and maybe that would make some of us feel better. But 10 years. From now he'll get out, and if we haven't addressed the underlying problems that created this situation, nothing will have really changed. Robert walked back to the podium. The FBI investigation found systematic problems in this police department. Racial profiling, excessive force, complaints that were ignored, officers who were protected instead of being held accountable. He looked at Chief Torres, who had resigned in disgrace. But those problems didn't start with Chief Torres, and they won't end with his resignation. Those problems exist because we have allowed them to exist. Robert pulled out a folder and opened it. I want to share some statistics with you. In the past 3 years, black residents of Riverside were 3 times more likely to be pulled over by police than white residents. They were 5 times more likely to have their cars searched, but they were actually less likely to be found with contraband. He let that sink in. That's not Officer Mills' fault. That's all of our fault. We created a system that allowed this to happen, and we're all responsible for fixing it. Robert looked around the room again. So here's what I'm proposing. Instead of just sending Officer Mills to prison and pretending the problem is solved, I want to work with this community to actually solve the problem. He outlined his plan. First, Officer Mills will serve 18 months in federal prison. That's justice. There have to be consequences for violating someone's civil rights. Mills nodded, accepting his fate. But after he serves his time, if He's willing. Officer Mills will work with me and other community leaders to reform police training not just here in Riverside, but across the country. Robert turned to Mills again. Officer Mills, you will tell your story to police academies, to training programs, to other officers. You will help us understand how good people can make terrible decisions and how we can prevent it from happening. Mills looked up. Mr. Johnson, why would anyone listen to me? I'm a disgrace to the badge. Robert nodded. Officer Mills, that's exactly why people will listen to you. Because you've been where they are. Because you understand how easy it is to let prejudice and fear guide your decisions instead of training and professionalism. The crowd was listening intently now. Second, Robert continued, the Riverside Police Department will be completely restructured. New leadership, new training, new accountability measures, and the community will be involved in every step of that process. He looked at the citizens in the audience. You will help hire new officers. You will help design training programs. You will help create the policies that govern how you want to be policed in your own community. An elderly black woman in the third row stood up. Mr. Johnson, that sounds good, but how do we know things will really change? We've heard promises before. Robert nodded. Ma'am, that's a fair question. Here's how we'll know. Because we're going to measure everything. Traffic stops, searches, complaints, use of force incidents. All of it will be tracked, analyzed, and made public every quarter. He pointed to a young man near the back. You, sir, are you a college student? Yes, sir. I study criminal justice at the community college. Would you like a job helping us analyze police data and create transparency reports for the community? The young man's eyes widened. Yes, sir. Then you're hired. We're going to train a new generation of community leaders who understand both law enforcement and civil rights. For the next hour, Robert outlined a comprehensive reform plan. Body cameras that couldn't be turned off. Citizen review boards with real authority. Mental health and de-escalation training for all officers. Community policing programs that built relationships instead of just making arrests. But most importantly, he outlined a cultural change. We're going to change the way we think about police work in this community, he said. Instead of seeing citizens as potential criminals, officers will be trained to see themselves as public servants whose job is to help and protect everyone equally. When Robert finished speaking, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then something unexpected happened. Officer Mills stood up. Mr. Johnson, he said, his voice shaky but determined, I accept your offer. I'll serve my time, and then I'll do whatever you ask me to do to make this right. Mills looked around the room at all the people he had potentially wronged through his years of biased policing. To everyone in this room, to everyone in this community, I'm sorry. I'm truly, deeply sorry. I became exactly the kind of cop that I should have been protecting you from. Tears were streaming down his face now. I can't undo what I did to Mr. Johnson. I can't take BA.